Little Hemsby, as usual, presented itself to Inspector Purbright with a serenity that bordered on tautness, the sort of calm which in quieter towns often concealed more than it revealed. He arrived at the vicarage just as the morning sun cast thin, pale light over the gravel path, the air unusually still except for the faint rustle of letters carried by a timid breeze. Father Aldridge had been discovered in a faintly disconcerting state the previous evening, murmuring under his breath on the vicarage steps before the verger, Mr. Collingwood, had seen fit to offer assistance. Purbright, who had long cultivated a patience for human hesitation, noted the precise shape of the vicar's anxiety, measured, understated, yet telling in its inconsistency. The vicar's study was a model of ecclesiastical order. Books, letters, and newspapers were arranged with such precise regularity that any small displacement suggested a minor social catastrophe. Tea was served in delicate china, steam curling modestly toward the ceiling, the air carrying a hint of lavender from Mrs. Dalrymple's habitual polishing. Purbright observed the verger's movements, a careful straightening of a stack of envelopes, the slow folding of a parish newsletter, the almost imperceptible glance toward a closed window. He took these gestures in as if they were the opening lines of a confession. "You will understand," began Father Aldridge, his voice measured, "that I am quite recovered. The evening air, it appears, has certain effects on constitution." There was no malice in the statement, yet its indirectness bore the faintest aroma of defensiveness. Purbright inclined his head slightly, noting the careful placement of hands upon the table, the gentle twitch of a wrist, as if urging himself to remain composed. "Indeed, sir," said Purbright, his tone both neutral and interrogative. "The parish has been most concerned, naturally. Letters, I see, have accumulated." He allowed the word "concerned" to linger, carefully observing the vicar's reaction. Aldridge nodded, adjusting the folds of his clerical collar with a precision that implied discipline, but also self-consciousness. The letters, neatly stacked, formed a subtle map of the town's social pulse. One was typed with the heading of the parish committee's charity drive. Another, handwritten, hinted at minor anxieties over the churchyard fence, now the subject of whispered debate among local historical enthusiasts. Each envelope, each loop of the cursive handwriting spoke of civility under strain, of complaints and corrections couched in politeness. Purbright allowed his eyes to linger, recognizing that in Little Hemsby reputation was a fragile lattice, sustained by whispers and half-meant compliments, yet capable of snapping under the lightest scrutiny. Tea was poured with deliberate grace, each movement a careful punctuation in a conversation rife with subtext. The verger's eyes shifted toward the vicar at intervals as if measuring the temperature of his distress. Mrs. Dalrymple hovered near, ready to offer sugar or a polite aside, her expression neutral but taut, hinting at both loyalty and a nervousness she did not entirely disguise. Purbright recognized the choreography. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet fully revealing to a trained observer. As they sipped, the conversation meandered to the parish newsletter. A typographical error in the most recent edition, a simple misprint regarding the annual refreshments, had produced mild but pointed letters from subscribers. Each writer, Purbright noted, couched their criticism in a veneer of civility, their remarks carefully framed to avoid direct offence. Yet the choices of words, the hesitations in punctuation, betrayed an undercurrent of social anxiety. The vicar, who had attempted to smooth the situation, now found himself navigating a lattice of implied rebuke, polite exaggeration, and discreet judgment. "Curious," Purbright murmured, more to himself than to any present. "How even the smallest misplacement of letters or a slip in printing may ripple through the town as though it were a scandal of considerable import?" Aldridge, whose own thoughts were measured and deliberate, nodded, his expression almost imperceptibly tense. The verger, careful to avoid eye contact, rearranged the tablecloth with a subtle emphasis, suggesting both respect and unspoken warning. Outside, the sun had climbed, slanting across the vicarage garden where roses bloomed with near-militant regularity. Purbright, observing the faint disturbance of petals and shadows, felt the faintest stir of curiosity. A window on the stairs had been left slightly ajar, not from oversight, he suspected, but with intention, or perhaps merely as a signal of unease. One could not assume malice, yet neither could one dismiss deliberate imprecision in such a meticulously ordered household. By the time Purbright took his leave, he had accumulated a wealth of understated clues, a glance too long, a letter mislaid, a gesture of the hand that spoke of something withheld. The vicar returned to his duties with a composed air, though the slight tightening of his lips suggested ongoing contemplation. The verger, silent and attentive, watched the inspector depart, leaving only the faintest echo of footfalls on the gravel path. And as Purbright walked away, he considered the possibility that the most revealing disturbances in Little Hemsby were neither loud nor dramatic. They were subtle, social, moral. And the briefest whisper, a slightly open window, or a cautious note, might carry a truth waiting for discovery. In that quiet moment, he allowed himself the smallest smile. The game had begun, and the first faintly incriminating ripple had already appeared. Inspector Purbright returned to Little Hemsby with the precise punctuality that marked his professional habits. The morning air carried a faint chill, enough to suggest winter's reluctant hold on the countryside without causing outright discomfort. He had resolved, before approaching the vicarage or speaking to the verger, to observe the parish in its normal rhythm, attending first to the routines that often revealed what words carefully concealed. The post office, he noted, remained the centre of small-town information, a repository of both intention and inadvertent disclosure. Mrs. Tilling, the postmistress, greeted him with polite civility, eyebrows arching at the unspoken news she evidently preferred not to share openly. "I trust the vicar is in some measure recovered?" she asked, her tone casual, but weighted with curiosity. Purbright inclined his head, allowing a minimal confirmation to pass without elaboration. He noted the way her hands lingered on the counter, a subtle hesitancy suggesting she possessed knowledge of correspondences that might be relevant, yet she spoke only in the generalities customary to her position. Letters piled in neat stacks on shelves appeared innocuous, yet the inspector observed a particular envelope, slightly protruding, marked in an unfamiliar hand. A minor anomaly in arrangement, perhaps, but one that suggested both intentionality and anxiety. Purbright next visited the parish committee for the charity drive, a group of individuals whose politeness often concealed a meticulously maintained hierarchy. He arrived during their mid-morning discussion on the upcoming raffle, where the conversation, outwardly civil, was punctuated by careful assertions of precedents and unspoken grievances. "It has been suggested," began Miss Cartwright, with the calm inflection of habitual authority, "that the refreshments be served in accordance with tradition, as the vicar intended. Otherwise, one risks unfortunate perception." There was a brief silence in which all parties measured their responses, considering both the tradition and the social implications of deviation. Purbright observed the subtle gestures, Miss Cartwright's tightening of lips, Mr. Dunlop's brief adjustment of spectacles, the quiet folding of arms by Mrs. Fenwick. Each motion was a minor assertion of hierarchy, an unspoken signal of opinion. He took note of the phrasing, the pauses, the polite avoidance of direct disagreement. It was in such intervals, these slivers of conversational space, that the moral landscape of Little Hemsby revealed itself. Small resentments, carefully masked by civility, indicated the weight of reputation on behaviour and the latent anxiety over perceived impropriety. During the discussion, a letter was inadvertently left on the table. Its contents, partly obscured by the envelope, hinted at a parishioner's private concern regarding the vicar's recent interactions. Purbright recognised the deliberate yet cautious manner in which it had been delivered, the way the envelope had been placed, so as to suggest both disclosure and discretion. He noted the reactions, a subtle intake of breath, a barely perceptible shift in seating, the practiced avoidance of eye contact. Each gesture conveyed far more than the words themselves, revealing the interplay of guilt, loyalty, and prudence that governed the parish. Later, he called upon the verger, Mr. Collingwood, in the sanctuary. The church smelled faintly of beeswax polish and old oak, the air charged with the scent of incense lingering from the previous evening's service. Collingwood moved with quiet deliberation, placing hymnals in their racks and straightening kneelers with almost obsessive care. "The vicar, sir," he began, "is quite well, though there have been visitors at times that perhaps merit discreet attention." His words were carefully balanced between disclosure and deference, a verbal tightrope that hinted at observations without stating conclusions. Purbright, seated on the polished pew, allowed a faint nod to signal acknowledgment while remaining entirely neutral. Tea was served in the vestry where Mrs. Dalrymple had prepared a modest selection of biscuits. Conversation drifted, formal and understated, from parish finances to the weather, each topic imbued with the latent tension of social propriety. Purbright noted who poured the tea, who accepted it with minimal acknowledgment, and who remained silent, letting politeness dictate their participation. It was in these minor interactions, the inspector reflected, that the town revealed its true preoccupations, maintaining reputation while discreetly assessing the behaviour of neighbours. A subtle revelation came when a misplaced ledger was discovered beneath a hymnal on the choir stall. Its entries, though mundane in content, small donations, flower arrangements, and the allocation of funds for repairs, contained marginal notes in a faint hand. Observations about parishioners' punctuality, demeanour, and interactions were recorded with the precision of one keenly aware of the social ecosystem. Purbright allowed himself a small, inward smile. The ledger was a silent map of influence, obligation, and anxiety, documenting the moral undercurrents that the parish carefully concealed beneath civility. By the time he departed, Inspector Purbright had accumulated a subtle but telling collection of observations: a mislaid envelope, a ledger's marginalia, the half-spoken concern of the verger, and the faint tremor of worry beneath polite conversation. He understood that in Little Hemsby, revelation was seldom abrupt. It arrived in gestures, glances, and the careful placement of letters and ledgers. Walking down the gravel path toward the village green, he paused briefly at the vicarage gate. A curtain flickered in the window above, as though someone inside had observed his departure. Perhaps a casual glance, or perhaps the very beginning of recognition, an awareness that the town's secret lattice of observation had acknowledged his presence. And in that faint flicker, Purbright felt the quiet thrill of an unfolding puzzle. Not a crime, not yet, but the first suggestion that beneath civility, beneath meticulously maintained decorum, there existed the potential for revelation. A ledger here, a glance there, these, he knew, were the instruments through which the town might eventually betray itself, subtly, deliberately, and with infinite patience. The next morning, Inspector Purbright arrived at the vicarage with a measured sense of anticipation. The village had settled into its usual rhythm, the cobbled streets bearing a cautious polish from the early frost, and the low sun casting long, tentative shadows across the churchyard. Purbright's attention, however, was drawn less to the scenery than to the parish newsletter freshly posted on the notice board. It bore a typographical misprint, innocuous to a casual observer, yet revealing in its choice of wording. The announcement of annual confessions instead of annual refreshments seemed accidental at first glance, yet in Little Hemsby no error remained unexamined. Purbright lingered for a moment, noting the reactions of villagers who paused to read the newsletter. Mrs. Tilling, the postmistress, gave a faint twitch of disapproval, while Mr. Dunlop, a local historian, whispered something to Miss Cartwright, who responded with a subtle narrowing of eyes. Each observer's behaviour, so meticulously controlled, betrayed an awareness that extended beyond mere typographical inconvenience. Politeness masked curiosity, and curiosity masked judgment. Even the faintest smile suggested moral calculation. In such matters, Purbright reflected, the town's social lattice was infinitely more revealing than words alone. He entered the vicarage, greeted with the careful precision of the household staff. Mrs. Dalrymple had arranged tea as if the misprint itself required compensation, a display of civility heightened to near ceremonial proportions. Father Aldridge, composed yet faintly tense, remarked with his habitual restraint, "It is remarkable how minor errors may invite commentary. One might almost say they reveal what is otherwise carefully concealed." Purbright inclined his head slightly, permitting the vicar's observation to stand unchallenged. In his experience, such remarks, offered in formal cadence, often contained more truth than the most forthright confession. They spoke briefly of the newsletter's circulation, and Purbright observed with quiet attention the interplay of the vicar's subtle gestures. The brief raising of eyebrows, the slight tremor in a gloved hand, the careful avoidance of direct eye contact when referencing specific parishioners. Each movement hinted at social unease, at awareness of observation from multiple angles. A letter lay on the desk, partly exposed, its envelope slightly askew. Purbright noted the handwriting faintly familiar and mentally catalogued it as a potential thread to follow. Later, he attended a parish council meeting, convened to discuss the upcoming annual bazaar. The discussion was outwardly civil, yet under the surface, tension was evident in the precise phrasing of comments and the timing of interruptions. Miss Cartwright, speaking of floral arrangements, added the stipulation that all decorations adhere strictly to precedent, a statement that, on inspection, seemed intended less to enforce tradition than to assert influence over others' choices. Mr. Dunlop, tasked with organizing refreshments, nodded politely while adjusting his spectacles, a gesture that signaled both compliance and subtle dissent. Purbright's attention roamed across the room, noting who laughed faintly at another's quip, who refrained from comment, and who, by remaining silent, implied moral superiority. A stray remark from Mrs. Fenwick revealed a discrepancy in the allocation of raffle prizes. "It appears, I believe," she said, her tone mild, "that some contributions may have been overlooked in the recent ledger." The room paused, each attendee's reaction carefully moderated. Politeness demanded acknowledgement, yet the underlying scrutiny was unmistakable. Purbright's mind catalogued these small ripples, missed entries, slight overstatements, the deliberate phrasing of correction. In Little Hemsby, it seemed, the minutiae of record-keeping bore more consequence than a minor financial oversight in any other town. After the meeting, Purbright lingered in the hallway, where a faint draught shifted the edge of a newsletter lying upon his side table. The misprint he had noted that morning seemed suddenly to take on significance in the context of prior discussions. It was not merely a typographical slip, it had acted as a prism, refracting the attitudes and anxieties of the parish. The inspector made a mental note to compare handwriting, phrasing, and the sequence of complaints, recognizing that these small discrepancies were a language in themselves, capable of revealing the unspoken moral hierarchy of the community. The day concluded with a brief call to the verger, who offered tea in the sanctuary while carefully monitoring Purbright's expressions. "I trust, sir," Collingwood said, in his typical understated tone, "that the newsletter has caused no undue alarm." Purbright permitted a faint, almost imperceptible smile, noting that the verger's question carried more weight than it disclosed. The query suggested awareness of minor social fissures, a readiness to protect reputation, and an implicit acknowledgement that the observer might discern more than the observed intended. As Purbright departed, the light had softened across the churchyard, highlighting gravestones that had borne silent witness to generations of unspoken judgments. A curtain in the vicarage window flickered briefly, suggesting a glance of curiosity or concern. Purbright's mind lingered on the misprinted newsletter, the minor corrections, and the silent calculations of the parishioners. The chapter concluded not with revelation, nor with dramatic disclosure, but with the faintest suggestion that a town so attentive to its own reputation would inevitably reveal truths in the smallest gestures, the subtlest errors, and the quietest glances. Inspector Purbright arrived at the vicarage in the late morning, the winter sun reflecting weakly off frost-hardened cobbles and casting pale, elongated shadows across the carefully tended lawn. The village, as ever, proceeded with its habitual caution. Windows drawn, shutters aligned, and hedgerows trimmed to precise heights, as though the very landscape were complicit in maintaining an air of genteel propriety. Inside, the vicarage presented its familiar calm, the scent of lavender polish mingling with faint traces of ink from the morning letters. Yet beneath this measured tranquillity, Purbright perceived the almost imperceptible tension that marked a household attuned to the subtleties of observation. Mrs. Dalrymple, the long-time housekeeper, greeted him with customary civility, her voice calm but slightly tremulous, as if the act of speaking itself required rehearsal. Inspector Father Aldridge is, well, he is quite recovered. Though perhaps he is thoughtful, she added, the final word delivered with the hesitation of one aware that understatement might itself conceal meaning. Purbright inclined his head, noting the careful placement of her hands upon the serving tray, the manner in which she adjusted the folds of her apron, as if to restore order, both literal and social. Father Aldridge emerged from his study, carrying a neatly bound volume of parish records. His movements were measured, almost ritualistic, and he spoke with formal deliberation. "I am grateful for your attention, Inspector. There are matters which, though perhaps minor in consequence, bear on the subtle workings of our community." His eyes flickered briefly toward the slightly open window in the hallway, an unspoken invitation or signal which Purbright filed for future consideration. The vicar's voice, soft and even, masked the latent anxiety of someone balancing knowledge, discretion, and reputation. Tea was served in the sitting room, the china arranged with precise care, the steam rising in faint, elegant curls. Purbright allowed his gaze to roam, noting each gesture. Mrs. Dalrymple's slight bow when pouring, the vicar's clasped hands resting on the table, the brief glance the verger cast toward the door, as if calculating the appropriate moment to interject. Conversation began with unremarkable politeness, drifting toward parish activities and the routine allocation of responsibilities. Yet in every turn of phrase, every deliberate pause, Purbright discerned the layered pressures of expectation and moral propriety. "I have received visitors at odd hours," the vicar admitted, in a tone neither defensive nor revealing, though they were all of good intent. Nevertheless, one is obliged. Consider the impact upon perception. The phrasing was deliberately vague, as if to permit interpretation without disclosure. Purbright noted the subtle tension in the vicar's jaw, the careful avoidance of eye contact with Mrs. Dalrymple, and the slight shift of the verger's posture. All were gestures marking an awareness of scrutiny, of the moral lattice upon which the parish depended. The conversation meandered to the parish ledger, lying conspicuously on a side table. Marginal notes, faintly penciled, recorded observations of parishioners' behaviour, who arrived early for services, who lingered for private counsel, who seemed uneasy when observed. Purbright examined the entries with meticulous attention, recognizing that such notations, though ostensibly routine, were a map of social influence and reputation. One entry, noting a parishioner's uncharacteristic attention to the vicar's study window, hinted at subtle surveillance, curiosity restrained by civility, yet potentially significant. As the morning waned, Purbright observed Mrs. Dalrymple clearing the tea service with careful precision. Her movements were so deliberate that they seemed to punctuate the conversation with silent commentary, a slight tremor in her hand when handling the sugar, a soft pause before lifting the teapot. Each gesture conveyed restrained emotion, a discreet anxiety born of loyalty and proximity to the vicar's confidences. Purbright, aware of the cumulative weight of such minor observations, allowed himself a faint inward smile. In Little Hemsby, disclosure came as much through silence as through words. Later, he engaged the vicar in discussion of the parish letters received in the preceding weeks. Most were formal, courteous, and politely concerned. Yet one stood out, folded with care but hastily addressed, in a familiar hand. Its contents were not yet revealed, but the very handling suggested urgency, discretion, and the faintest trace of apprehension. Purbright filed this observation alongside the ledger notes, the glances, and the subtle adjustments of posture he had catalogued over the morning. Each was a thread in a lattice of social observation, moral obligation, and reputational anxiety. The inspector departed the vicarage shortly after midday, stepping into the cold clarity of the village street. The parish church towered in muted silhouette against the pale sky, a monument to centuries of ritualized behavior and communal oversight. As he walked toward the post office, a window in the vicarage flickered with movement, suggesting either idle attention or deliberate monitoring. Purbright paused, noting the gesture without comment. Even the most casual observation in Little Hemsby might bear significance, the faintest shift in demeanour a potential key to understanding hidden tensions. By the end of the chapter, Purbright's mental catalogue of anomalies had expanded. A ledger's marginal notation, a letter treated with unusual care, Mrs. Dalrymple's subtle tremor, and the flickering window. These were not revelations in themselves, but each hinted at a quiet disturbance, a moral or social dissonance, waiting for the right observation to expose it. As he turned the corner, the inspector allowed himself the faintest anticipation. Beneath the calm surface of Little Hemsby, the patterns of suspicion, loyalty, and discretion were beginning to converge, and a single, overlooked detail might illuminate all. Inspector Purbright began the day with a careful review of the letters that had arrived at the vicarage in recent weeks. They were neatly stacked in chronological order, their envelopes crisp, their handwriting variable in both legibility and tone. At first glance, the correspondence appeared banal: invitations to local fêtes, polite expressions of gratitude, and inquiries regarding the parish bazaar. Yet Purbright, whose experience had taught him that civility often cloaked calculation, noticed the faint signals embedded in the phrasing, the choice of words, and even the weight of the paper. In Little Hemsby, a single comma, or the absence of one, could carry the gravity of moral judgment. Father Aldridge joined him in the study, his movements deliberate and measured. "Most of these letters," he remarked in his soft, formal cadence, "are of the usual sort. Nevertheless, a few merit attention." He tapped a letter written in a neat, almost hesitant hand. Purbright studied it carefully. The writer referenced personal anxieties and the wisdom of discretion, phrases that might appear harmless to an untrained eye but suggested a social tension restrained only by polite phrasing. The vicar's fingers lingered on the envelope as if acknowledging both concern and unease. Tea was served promptly, with Mrs. Dalrymple executing each movement with the precision of someone accustomed to observing minute details without comment. The vicar's voice was soft, yet carried the undertone of cautious judgment. "One does wonder, Inspector, whether civility is sometimes employed to obscure truth." Purbright allowed this observation to rest, noting the subtle nod of the verger, who remained standing near the doorway, his posture alert, yet entirely composed. Every gesture in the vicarage seemed a controlled expression of social awareness, a recognition that the smallest breach of etiquette might convey disproportionate meaning. Purbright selected a letter at random, observing the curl of the paper and the faint impression of handwriting from previous pages. It referenced a parishioner's concern regarding a late visit to the vicarage, phrased in a tone of deference, but carrying an unmistakable undercurrent of expectation. "It seems," Purbright remarked quietly, "that observation in Little Hemsby extends beyond the obvious, does it not?" Father Aldridge allowed a faint, knowing smile. "Observation is a form of care, sometimes," he replied, leaving the ambiguity unresolved. Later, the inspector visited the post office, where Mrs. Tilling handled the letters with her habitual discretion. She hesitated over certain envelopes, tracing the handwriting with an index finger before placing them in the correct pigeonhole. Her movements were deliberate, and her brief glance toward Purbright was more telling than any spoken comment. The inspector noted the timing of her actions, the pauses, the choice to withhold a remark that might have clarified ambiguity. It was in these small silences that Little Hemsby's social hierarchy revealed itself. Returning to the vicarage, Purbright examined the letters more closely, cross-referencing handwriting, phrasing, and envelope placement. He noticed a subtle pattern. Letters containing the faintest expressions of concern tended to be accompanied by minor social observations, almost as if civility was performing the dual role of mask and messenger. A note mentioning the annual bazaar, for example, included a postscript in the margin concerning punctuality at services, a minor detail which suggested scrutiny and implied judgment. The cumulative effect of these annotations painted a quiet map of moral anxiety and reputational calculation. Father Aldridge invited Purbright to examine the ledger in conjunction with the letters. Marginalia noted not only who contributed to funds or refreshments, but also subtler indicators, who spoke in certain tones, who lingered, who appeared discomforted when observed. Cross-referencing these entries with the letters revealed a lattice of expectation, discretion, and social oversight, with each parishioner participating in the reinforcement of propriety while simultaneously noting deviations from it. Purbright observed the vicar's eyes as he examined the records, recognizing a mixture of prudence and fatigue. It was the weight of observation itself rather than scandal that seemed to trouble him most. The morning ended with a brief consultation with the verger, who offered tea in the vestry, a room permeated with the faint scent of wax polish and old wood. "Most of the letters, sir," Collingwood remarked, carefully choosing each word, "are of routine concern. Yet occasionally one senses a subtle unease." Purbright noted the understated tremor in the verger's hands as he refilled cups, the slight tilt of his head when glancing toward the vicar's study. Every movement, minor as it was, indicated attentiveness and perhaps concealed apprehension. As Purbright departed, the afternoon light slanting across the churchyard cast elongated shadows that seemed to echo the lattice of observation he had documented. He paused briefly at the vicarage gate, reflecting on the letters, the ledger, and the silent gestures that accompanied them. A window above flickered with the shadow of a figure drawing the curtain, subtle yet deliberate. Purbright catalogued the moment, a small, seemingly trivial act, but one pregnant with implication. Beneath the calm surface of civility, a quiet disturbance was taking shape, and the next misstep, word, glance, or gesture might illuminate the latent tensions of Little Hemsby more fully than any overt revelation. Inspector Purbright returned to Little Hemsby on a morning tempered by a weak sun and a frost that lingered only in shadowed corners. The village, still meticulously arranged, displayed its customary air of decorum. Shutters aligned, hedgerows clipped, and a faint sense that every resident's movements were quietly observed by unseen eyes. Purbright, for his part, was chiefly interested in these invisible social currents, where moral judgment flowed more freely than conversation, and minor gestures often carried disproportionate weight. His first visit was to the verger, Mr. Collingwood, who awaited him near the sanctuary, standing as if every inch of the polished floor demanded careful attention. "Inspector," he said, with the slight hesitancy of one balancing obedience and disclosure. "There have been small disturbances, if one may use that term. Nothing scandalous, yet the usual harmony seems slightly, strained." Collingwood's phrasing was cautious, his tone respectful, and yet the underlying anxiety was plain to Purbright. The verger's subtle tremor of the hand as he adjusted a hymn book suggested a deeper consciousness of oversight than he permitted himself to acknowledge aloud. Tea was served in the vestry, precisely arranged to permit observation without overt intrusion. Mrs. Dalrymple moved with quiet deliberation, her eyes flicking toward the vicar's study at intervals as if expecting some sign, some subtle signal. The conversation began with the usual formalities, the weather, the parish accounts, the upcoming charity bazaar. Yet beneath this ordinary discourse, there existed a lattice of implicit judgment, a mutual assessment of loyalty, discretion, and propriety. Purbright listened to each carefully measured phrase, each polite inflection, recognizing them as instruments of social navigation rather than mere communication. "I understand, Inspector," began Collingwood, "that there has been some discussion concerning the conduct of certain parishioners. It is, of course, a delicate matter, and one wishes to avoid offence." His gaze briefly met Purbright's, a flicker of apprehension passing through the otherwise controlled posture. The inspector inclined his head slightly, acknowledging both the statement and the hesitation behind it. In Little Hemsby, he reflected, the avoidance of direct accusation was often more revealing than any explicit claim. The inspector proceeded to question the verger about recent visitors to the vicarage. Collingwood spoke of them in elliptical terms. "They arrive, sir, as one might expect, with civility and good intent. Yet their attention to certain details, timing, emphasis, repetition, suggests observation beyond necessity." Purbright noted the phrasing, the pauses, the careful modulation of voice. Each word, chosen to minimize exposure while hinting at unease, added to a growing picture of communal anxiety where even minor deviations from routine were noted and quietly evaluated. Later, Purbright arranged to speak with Miss Cartwright and Mr. Dunlop, the senior figures of the parish committee. Their meeting took place in the vicarage sitting-room, where light from tall windows fell on polished floorboards in muted slats. Conversation proceeded with careful formality, each participant measured in posture, intonation, and gesture. Miss Cartwright, discussing arrangements for the bazaar, repeated a phrase concerning adherence to precedent, emphasizing tradition in such a way that it simultaneously conveyed authority and implied caution. Mr. Dunlop responded with mild acquiescence, though the slight narrowing of his eyes betrayed an internal calculation, a judgment restrained by politeness. Purbright observed the subtle exchanges, the the placement of hands, the positioning of chairs, the polite avoidance of one another's gaze at certain intervals. Each minor movement was laden with unspoken meaning, a reflection of reputational concern and mutual scrutiny. A brief mention of the vicar's health produced a barely perceptible shift in posture from Miss Cartwright, a slight stiffening, as if the topic, while necessary to address, carried potential social risk. The inspector catalogued these movements as meticulously as any physical evidence, recognizing that the moral dynamics of Little Hemsby often revealed themselves in silence, in hesitation, and in carefully calibrated gestures. During the meeting, a stray note fell from a ledger onto the carpet. It contained a marginal observation concerning a parishioner's unusual attentiveness, written in faint pencil. Purbright picked it up without comment, noting the reactions. Miss Cartwright's subtle glance toward the vicar's study, Mr. Dunlop's faint tightening of the lips, and the almost imperceptible adjustment of his own coat. The minor disturbance was enough to momentarily shift the balance of the room, revealing the latent tension that existed beneath the surface of civility. By the afternoon, Purbright had accumulated a subtle constellation of clues, careful phrasing, hesitant gestures, a marginal note, and the verger's understated anxiety. Each was individually negligible. Collectively, they formed a faint but coherent outline of social pressure, moral scrutiny, and reputational vulnerability. Walking back through the frost-hardened streets toward the vicarage gate, he paused as a curtain flickered briefly in the window above. The gesture was slight, possibly inadvertent, yet Purbright catalogued it as meaningful. In Little Hemsby, the smallest act of observation could presage disclosure. As he turned the corner, he allowed himself the faintest satisfaction. The threads of civility, discretion, and latent judgment were converging with a subtle inevitability. Not a scandal, not yet, but the lattice of reputations, moral obligations, and restrained observation was beginning to reveal the first outlines of a pattern, one that might ultimately illuminate the quiet disturbances of the parish. The day's work, understated as it appeared, had brought Purbright closer to the point at which civility might falter, and he was keen to observe which glance, gesture, or word would first betray it. The parish council convened in the vicarage hall precisely as scheduled, though the room seemed to carry an unspoken expectation that every gesture and inflection would be observed, assessed, and quietly judged. Inspector Purbright arrived with the deliberate calm that had become his hallmark, taking a seat near the back where he could survey the proceedings without drawing attention to himself. Light slanted through tall, mullioned windows, highlighting polished floorboards and the gleam of varnished pews repurposed for council seating. The atmosphere, outwardly civil, carried the latent tension of an assembly acutely aware of its own proprieties. Miss Cartwright, chair of the committee, opened the meeting with a gentle, formal intonation. "I trust we are all prepared to discuss the arrangements for the annual bazaar," she said, each word measured, her posture impeccable. Mr. Dunlop, seated diagonally across the table, inclined his head slightly, a subtle signal of acquiescence that masked a trace of internal dissent. Mrs. Fenwick adjusted her spectacles before speaking, an act so slight as to be easily overlooked, yet one that marked her readiness to interpose with cautious commentary. Purbright's eyes roved across the assembly, noting the interplay of gestures, glances, and the faint modulation of voices. Discussion began with ostensibly trivial matters, the placement of tables, the schedule for refreshments, and the allocation of raffle prizes. Yet beneath these ordinary topics, Purbright discerned a carefully choreographed social dance. Miss Cartwright emphasized adherence to tradition in such a way that implied both authority and subtle reproach. Mr. Dunlop's mild agreement suggested internal negotiation, a delicate balance between compliance and discreet critique. Even the silences between statements carried meaning, each pause weighted with observation, judgment, and the potential for censure. A minor disagreement arose concerning the timing of the flower display. "It is customary," Miss Cartwright remarked, with deliberate cadence, "to allow the vicar a final inspection prior to opening. Deviations, however minor, may reflect poorly upon the committee." There was no overt rebuke, yet the statement carried the precise undertone of social censure. Mr. Dunlop's fingers tapped lightly upon the table, a restrained indication of impatience, while Mrs. Fenwick inclined her head, the faintest pursing of lips betraying her internal appraisal of the remark. Purbright, noting these subtleties, recorded them silently. In Little Hemsby, moral judgments often arrived via implication rather than declaration. When attention shifted to the allocation of raffle prizes, Purbright observed the smallest of gestures. The verger's posture stiffening near the doorway, a nearly imperceptible glance toward the vicar's study, and a slight tremor in Miss Cartwright's hand as she adjusted a ribbon. These minor signals, though easily dismissed by any casual observer, suggested awareness of surveillance and reputational risk. Purbright allowed himself a quiet smile. The parish, in microcosm, revealed its social lattice with every gesture and inflection. The inspector's attention was drawn to a subtle anomaly in the ledger that lay open before the committee. A marginal note, penned in fine, almost cautious script, remarked upon a parishioner's early departure from a prior meeting, a detail of negligible practical consequence yet laden with social implication. Purbright sensed the tension in the room shift momentarily as eyes flickered toward the vicarage study, as if the notation itself carried the potential to be construed as commentary on loyalty, diligence, or propriety. The ledger, in its quiet precision, functioned as both record and instrument of reputational influence. Later, when tea was served, Purbright observed the choreography of manners: who poured, who accepted, who refrained. Each choice communicated subtle hierarchies, implicit alliances, and cautious disapproval. Mrs. Dalrymple's soft murmur of assistance, the verger's brief, attentive glances, and the chairwoman's restrained nod all contributed to an atmosphere where civility was maintained at the cost of hidden tension. A single misstep, a misplaced gesture, a hesitation in reply might expose underlying frictions long held in polite suspension. Toward the meeting's conclusion, a minor misstatement regarding the bazaar's refreshments prompted a faint ripple of correction, delivered with precise courtesy, yet brimming with tacit judgment. Purbright noted how each participant responded, a flicker of surprise in Mr. Dunlop's gaze, the careful modulation of Miss Cartwright's tone, and the verger's slight adjustment of posture, signalling attentiveness. These seemingly trivial reactions formed a quiet map of the moral and social hierarchies within the parish, revealing the interdependence of observation, discretion, and reputation. As the assembly dispersed, Purbright lingered to examine the ledger more closely. The marginalia suggested a pattern of surveillance, noting minor deviations, attentiveness, and subtle gestures that could imply disloyalty or impropriety. A window in the vicarage flickered as the curtain shifted, and he paused to observe it. The movement was slight, perhaps accidental, yet in Little Hemsby even the smallest act of observation might conceal significance. Purbright catalogued the gesture, adding it to the ledger, the glances, and the carefully moderated speech. By the end of the afternoon, he had compiled a detailed understanding of the parish's inner workings. Minor disagreements, subtle gestures, discreet surveillance, and the pervasive concern for reputation. There was no scandal yet, no dramatic revelation, only the quiet, deliberate web of social expectation and moral scrutiny. The chapter concluded with Purbright's mind quietly active, considering which gesture, glance, or notation might first expose the delicate lattice of propriety that governed little Hemsby. Even the faint flicker of a curtain had suggested that observation was ongoing, and that the next disclosure, however slight, might illuminate the patterns he had been tracing with such careful attention. Inspector Purbright returned to the vicarage in the early afternoon, noting that the light had softened into the gentle amber of late winter sun. The village appeared unchanged, polished, orderly, and tacitly self-conscious, but beneath the surface Purbright sensed the faintest ripples of tension. The vicarage itself exuded its habitual calm, though he observed the vicar pacing slowly near the window, hands clasped behind his back, as if rehearsing a conversation or weighing a confession not yet spoken aloud. Such careful rehearsal, Purbright reflected, was typical of a community in which observation, discretion, and reputation were inseparable. Father Aldridge greeted him with mild formality, inviting him into the study, where the letters and ledgers lay open on the polished desk. "Inspector," he said, voice measured yet tinged with subdued apprehension. "It seems that even in the absence of overt misdeeds one cannot escape moral ambiguity. A few parishioners have been, shall we say, unusually observant of my routines." Purbright inclined his head, noting both the choice of words and the deliberate restraint in phrasing. The vicar was signalling concern without claiming impropriety, leaving room for discretion and interpretation. Tea was served by Mrs. Dalrymple, her movements precise and unobtrusive, though the faint quiver of her hand betrayed awareness that her domestic labour was under quiet scrutiny. The conversation began with routine matters, the bazaar, the newsletter, and minor requests for assistance, but Purbright detected the subtle inflections that revealed unspoken anxieties. Each participant monitored the other with careful attention. Each phrase, each pause was a small test of loyalty, propriety, and discretion. Even the choice of which biscuit to take from the plate carried social significance, unspoken, yet undeniably present. "I have received a letter," the vicar said softly, offering it to Purbright with a careful slide across the desk. "It contains observations, politely phrased, regarding my habits and movements. One might dismiss it as idle attention, yet it carries implications." Purbright examined the envelope, noting the familiar hand and the restrained tone. The phrasing suggested vigilance, the kind born of reputational anxiety rather than curiosity, and the letter itself was a minor instrument of social regulation, a reminder that civility often disguised scrutiny. Later the inspector arranged to speak with the verger alone in the vestry where sunlight fell in faint stripes across the floor. Collingwood's posture was attentive, and his voice careful, measured. "Inspector, one cannot help but notice patterns," he began. "The parish observes in ways subtle yet persistent. Even minor deviations are remarked upon." The verger's hands trembled slightly as he gestured toward a ledger, and Purbright noted how the subtle movement betrayed both concern and fidelity to the vicar. Each small detail, he reflected, was part of a lattice of social observation that governed behaviour as surely as any law. Purbright returned to the study to examine the letter in detail. Marginal notes hinted at attentiveness to minor events, the vicar's early arrival at chapel, the precise handling of ledgers, the careful pacing of daily rituals. These were details of no immediate consequence, yet the very act of noting them suggested that observation itself had become a form of moral oversight. The cumulative effect, Purbright realized, was to create a climate in which even the most benign behavior carried potential social weight, and where civility could conceal judgment as surely as it could express care. A brief knock at the study door announced Miss Cartwright, who entered with measured courtesy, her expression composed yet alert. She spoke of the bazaar in formal terms, but her glances toward the ledger and letters were subtle yet deliberate, suggesting she was assessing both the vicar's state and Purbright's reactions. The inspector allowed the interaction to unfold, noting the tiny adjustments of posture, the soft modulation of voice, and the pauses that conveyed observation without overt comment. Each element added to the quiet understanding of the parish's social calculus, revealing a network of expectation, scrutiny, and latent disapproval. By mid-afternoon, Purbright had catalogued multiple, overlapping threads of attention. The letter, the marginalia, the verger's subtle gestures, the chairwoman's careful glances. They formed a faint but coherent outline of the moral and social lattice that governed the vicarage. As he prepared to leave, he paused near the window, noting the slight flicker of a curtain, a minor, almost imperceptible motion that suggested someone had been observing his departure. It was slight enough to be dismissed, yet in Little Hemsby, Purbright knew that even the smallest act of attention could reveal the existence of a silent observer and hint at the next disclosure. The day concluded with the realization that the parish's civility, its meticulously maintained proprieties, and its understated scrutiny were themselves a source of tension. No overt scandal had emerged, yet the moral lattice, built of letters, gestures, and marginal notes, was beginning to reveal the subtle conflicts and anxieties that underlay everyday interactions. As Purbright walked down the frost-hardened street, he allowed himself the faintest smile. The next minor act of observation, however small, might illuminate truths long concealed, and the lattice of civility would, inevitably, betray itself in the smallest flicker of motion or glance. Inspector Purbright arrived at Little Hemsby in the late morning, noting the faint glint of frost on window panes and the careful alignment of hedgerows that marked the village's unspoken insistence on order. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and distant bakery, yet beneath the calm veneer, Purbright sensed the quiet thrum of expectation. Each resident's movements, however routine, appeared measured against the standards of civility and reputation. It was a lattice of observation and moral scrutiny in which the slightest deviation could signal impropriety. He began the day at the vicarage, where Father Aldridge awaited him in the study, seated with hands folded over a neatly stacked pile of letters. "Inspector," the vicar said softly, "one begins to discern patterns in the minutiae of parish life. Not wrongdoing, necessarily, but a subtle attentiveness that borders on vigilance." His voice was measured, formal, yet contained the faintest tremor of concern. Purbright inclined his head slightly, registering the phrasing and the unspoken acknowledgment that civility often concealed both observation and judgment. Tea was served with meticulous care by Mrs. Dalrymple, whose movements were precise, yet punctuated by almost imperceptible hesitation. The vicar offered a comment on the upcoming bazaar, phrased to invite observation, yet carefully restrained. Purbright noted the minute shifts of posture, the gentle modulation of voice, and the delicate glances exchanged between the verger and the housekeeper. Even in these ordinary routines, the lattice of social scrutiny revealed itself. Minor gestures, half-turned heads, and measured pauses conveyed more than direct speech ever could. The inspector began his review of the parish ledger, noting marginalia that chronicled attentiveness and adherence to routine rather than overt misbehavior. One note, regarding a parishioner's punctuality at a recent committee meeting, was brief yet pointed, suggesting an implicit evaluation of diligence and propriety. Another referenced the early departure of a committee member, phrased as a neutral observation, but laden with subtle judgment. Purbright catalogued these notations carefully, recognizing that in Little Hemsby the social consequences of perceived lapses were as significant as formal breaches of decorum. Later, he requested a private audience with the verger. Collingwood's posture was attentive, hands folded, eyes alert, yet cautious. "Inspector," he began in his measured tone, "I have noticed that the same individuals tend to monitor one another with a precision that is both impressive and unsettling. Even minor departures from routine are remarked upon, silently but persistently." Purbright observed the faint tremor of Collingwood's fingers as he adjusted a hymn book. It was a small gesture, yet one that indicated both anxiety and fidelity to the moral lattice of the parish. The day's inquiries then led Purbright to the vicarage hall, where Miss Cartwright and Mr. Dunlop awaited him to discuss forthcoming arrangements. Their conversation was formal, interlaced with subtle gestures of observation. Miss Cartwright, in her habitual precise cadence, emphasized adherence to precedent, framing her statement as guidance while subtly assessing both Purbright and the vicar. Mr. Dunlop's soft, careful acquiescence, punctuated by the slight tightening of his lips, suggested a concurrent judgment, restrained by social convention, yet evident to a practiced observer. Purbright's attention was drawn to a letter placed near the ledger. Its phrasing, polite yet insistent, contained the faintest insistence on observation of the vicar's routines. There was a deliberate, almost imperceptible margin note regarding timing, phrasing, and attentiveness, a microcosm of the parish's habitual surveillance. The inspector noted the cumulative effect. Letters, marginalia, gestures, glances, and silences were forming a quiet pattern, revealing a network of scrutiny, moral anxiety, and the constant reinforcement of social expectation. By mid-afternoon he had compiled a subtle map of the parish's social dynamics. Each minor deviation, each carefully observed gesture, each marginal note contributed to a lattice of reputational pressure. Purbright reflected on the quiet, deliberate ways in which civility itself had become a tool of observation. Even Mrs. Dalrymple's soft murmur when serving tea, or Collingwood's posture near the doorway, carried the weight of implicit surveillance and moral expectation. As he prepared to depart, Purbright paused near the vicarage window, noting a brief flicker of movement behind the curtain. The gesture was slight, easily dismissed by anyone unaccustomed to subtlety. Yet to the inspector it suggested attention, curiosity, and possibly concealed concern. The window, like the letters and the ledger, was a point of observation, an indication that the parish's lattice of scrutiny extended beyond the vicarage walls. By the day's end, Purbright had not uncovered scandal nor overt transgression. Instead, he discerned a quiet pattern. Letters, marginalia, glances, gestures, and subtle hesitations converged to form a coherent lattice of moral scrutiny and reputational anxiety. The parish, he realized, was as much a network of observation as a community, and the next minor act, whether a glance, a note, or a gesture, might illuminate a hidden fissure or reveal the first tangible evidence of tension beneath the calm surface. Inspector Purbright arrived at Little Hemsby in the muted light of early afternoon, the frost-laden streets reflecting a faintly apprehensive calm. The village maintained its habitual polish, the hedgerows clipped with meticulous precision, windows aligned, and shutters closed just enough to suggest privacy without discourtesy. Yet beneath this orderly exterior, Purbright sensed the culmination of subtle currents he had been observing for weeks, the interplay of civility, scrutiny, and the delicate tensions of moral expectation. Today promised, quietly, the first revelation of patterns that had until now been only faintly perceptible. Father Aldridge received him in the study, seated behind the desk with hands folded over letters and marginalia. "Inspector," he said in soft, deliberate tones, It appears that the usual rhythms of parish life have, shall we say, begun to reveal themselves. Minor observations, subtle attentions. They accumulate in ways that may illuminate the nature of our community. Purbright inclined his head, noting the careful phrasing and the deliberate avoidance of direct accusation. The vicar's manner was formal yet intimate, a balance between disclosure and discretion. Tea was served in the sitting room, where Mrs. Dalrymple's movements retained their habitual precision, though her hand trembled slightly as she poured. Conversation began with the expected civility, inquiries about the bazaar, the newsletter, and the ongoing allocation of parish responsibilities. Yet beneath these ordinary topics, the inspector detected an intricate web of observation. Glances were exchanged with imperceptible timing, hands shifted to emphasize subtle points, and pauses were elongated in ways that suggested moral assessment rather than conversational necessity. Purbright returned to the ledger, cross-referencing entries with the letters, gestures, and minor observations he had collected over preceding days. Marginalia noted attentiveness to routine and small deviations, a parishioner's early arrival at committee meetings, the precise arrangement of refreshments, the care with which letters were folded and delivered. Alone, each note seemed trivial. Together they formed a lattice of subtle scrutiny and social expectation, revealing how civility itself functioned as a mechanism for observation and moral pressure. Later, the inspector requested a private discussion with the verger in the vestry. Collingwood spoke softly, his hands clasped and fingers tracing the edge of a hymn book. "Inspector, the parish observes with a consistency that is both admirable and disquieting. Even trivial variations, gestures that seem insignificant, are perceived and noted. The lattice of civility is, in a sense, a lattice of judgment." Purbright noted the phrasing, the hesitation before each clause, and the faint tremor in the verger's hands. Each minor gesture was laden with implication, both conscious and involuntary. The afternoon continued with the arrival of Miss Cartwright and Mr. Dunlop, whose discussion of the bazaar proceeded with meticulous attention to precedent. Miss Cartwright emphasized adherence to established custom, framing her words to guide without overt correction, while Mr. Dunlop's acquiescence was measured, accompanied by subtle micro-expressions of private assessment. Purbright catalogued these exchanges carefully, the positioning of chairs, the modulation of voice, the timing of glances, all were threads in the lattice he had been tracing. A minor note fell from the ledger as Miss Cartwright adjusted a stack of papers. It was a pencil notation referencing a parishioner's unusual attentiveness, phrased in a neutral tone, yet carrying a faint undercurrent of judgment. The room's occupants reacted imperceptibly, a slight pause in speech, the brief stiffening of posture, and the verger's subtle glance toward the study window. These minor adjustments, Purbright reflected, were as telling as any explicit remark, revealing the invisible network of social expectation and scrutiny that governed Little Hemsby. As the meeting drew to a close, Purbright reviewed the letters once more, noting the cumulative effect of phrasing, handwriting, and marginalia. Patterns of attentiveness, surveillance, and moral evaluation emerged, subtle yet coherent. Civility and discretion, previously seen as separate, were now revealed as two sides of a single mechanism, a lattice through which the parish continuously assessed itself and its members. Even small gestures, slight glances, and careful speech formed part of this intricate social architecture. Before departing, Purbright paused at the vicarage window, noting the flicker of movement behind the curtain, a minor, almost imperceptible shift, yet to him pregnant with implication. The act suggested awareness, attention, and perhaps anticipation. The lattice of observation he had catalogued over weeks was alive and responsive. The smallest action could illuminate patterns otherwise concealed, and the next subtle disclosure might finally expose the latent moral tensions underpinning parish life. As Purbright stepped onto the frost-hardened street, he reflected on the cumulative work of days spent cataloguing gestures, letters, marginalia, and silences. There had been no overt scandal, no dramatic revelation, yet the lattice of civility and scrutiny had been revealed in full. The parish's moral architecture, once invisible, was now legible, ready to be interpreted through the smallest signs of attention, hesitation, and observation. Even the flicker of a curtain could serve as a key, a subtle question poised to unlock the hidden workings of Little Hemsby.